what the similarity between these two verses is? Exact same Greek words. But New American Standard does not translate the second one the same way it does in John chapter 3, verse 36. I just thought that was up a lot of trouble and that type of thing, whatever reason. But that's the reason that he leaves and goes to Galilee. So verse 3, he leaves and goes to Galilee. But verse 4 says he needed to go through Samaria. Did he need to go through Samaria? First of all, in connection between Judea and Galilee, where is Samaria? Right in between. It would make logical sense. It would be the shortest route to get from Judea to Galilee. Okay? But why is it odd then? The Jews would not. A Jew to say this, I need to go through Samaria, would be unheard of, unthinkable for a Jew to say, I need to go through Samaria, even though it would be the quickest route. No, they avoided Samaria at all costs. They did not need to go through Samaria. They went a circuitous route to Galilee. But Jesus, we start, even in that one statement, we start to see Jesus' attitude and how it's different than others. Okay? And he needed to go through Samaria. And we understand that Jesus had a particular reason to go through Samaria. But in verse 5, he goes to Sychar. Colby mentioned this in his sermon last week. The same as Shechem there. But he's weary from his journey in verse 6. And he sits down by Jacob's well. His disciples have gone off to buy some food. And then a Samaritan woman comes to draw water. And in verse 7, Jesus says to her, give me a drink. And that starts a conversation that goes from verse 7 down to verse 26. So the next question. Why did the disciples feel uncomfortable about Jesus talking to the Samaritan woman? We don't see this until verse 27, so kind of skips the conversation and comes back to it. But why were the disciples uncomfortable about this? Or first of all, how do we know they were uncomfortable? Okay, so that's why Jews did not have dealings with Samaritans. In verse 27 tells us that they marveled. When they came back after going to get food, they marveled that he talked with a woman. Okay? Yet no one said, what do you seek, or why are you talking with her? Okay, so they marveled, but they didn't say anything. So they're just thinking this. Why is he talking to her? And especially that she is a Samaritan. In verse 9, the Samaritan woman actually helps us to understand this relationship between Jews and Samaritans, because after Jesus asks for a drink, verse 9, what is her first response to Jesus? What is her first response? Give me a drink. What's her first response? Why are you talking to me? Because Jews don't talk to Samaritans. Jews don't interact with Samaritans. But here Jesus is simply asking her, give me a drink. So I think that answers the question, that they felt uncomfortable. One, because she's a woman. Okay? But two, because she's a Samaritan. In the relationship between Jews and Samaritans.
Okay. Is it my knowledge why did the Jews deal with it?
That is a great lead-in question to what we need to talk about why. Why is there this relationship that is so, distinct, separate? Okay, well, let's talk about that. So the next question here. Question number 4 is, explain why Samaritans were considered inferior by the Jewish leaders. So somebody explain who the Samaritans are. So you go back, we have to go back in history. So we're going to go back 700 and some odd years back, okay? When the northern kingdom of Israel was basically destroyed by the Assyrians. Who did they leave in the land? So Assyria comes in, destroys Israel. Who did they leave in the land? The lowest of the low people, the poorest of the poor people, they left. So they left some Jewish people in the land. Okay? But then what did the Assyrians do? To be able to take care of the land, what was their practice? They brought people in from all the other nations that they had conquered. So what you ended up with in the land of Israel is you ended up with the feeblest of Jews intermarrying and having relationships with people of all different nations, heathen nations. So what rose, fast forward 700 years now, is what arose was a distinct group of people who were half Jews and half something else. So it was, like Don said, a kind of half-breed type of a thing. So the Jews developed a hatred because they weren't really the same type of thing. Right. Right. Yeah, and I think that was a question, as I read through the material, I think he had a line in there that said that there wasn't one drop of Jewish blood left in them, and I was like, no, I wouldn't say that. But I would say that because it's been so long, they have very little Jewish blood, perhaps, in their veins. It was mutual. Okay. Was it? Maybe it was, but it was just something that caught my eye there. Right, they couldn't trace their lineage, right? Okay. All right, so we have this distinct nation. They're considered inferior by the Jewish leaders because of that. What is different about the living water which Christ will provide and the water from Jacob's well? So this is the real core of the conversation, right? Give me a drink, thinking physically, water from this well. But then Jesus basically says in his response in verse 10, after verse 9, she had said, why are you asking me? Jews don't have dealings with Samaritans. And Jesus in verse 10 basically says, if you knew who I was, you would have asked me for water instead of me asking you for water. Right? So it becomes a conversation about the living water that Jesus could provide. So what is different about this water? Okay, so if you drink from Jacob's well, which the Samaritan woman would have done, and Jesus was asking for, you drink the water, and what happens? You'll get thirsty again, right? You drink some water, and then you go do something else, and you're thirsty again. It doesn't last. It's physical water. But Jesus turns that around and says, if you drink of the living water, the water I can give you, you'll never thirst again. And obviously it's talking about spiritual. It's not literal physical water. And the phrase is said there in verse 14 of this water. But whoever drinks of the water that I shall give him will never thirst. But the water that I shall give him will become in him a fountain of water springing up into everlasting life. So this living water is something that can not only cause you to never thirst, but it will spring up into everlasting life. Okay. What made the woman at the well think Jesus was a prophet? Okay, so he knows things about her that he should not have been able to know. Okay? Now, first of all, let's notice the transition here. Jesus said that in verse 14 about the living water. Verse 15, the woman's reaction to that was, I want some of that. I want some of that water. Now, she's still thinking physically. I think she's thinking, I don't want to have to draw water anymore and come to this well and draw water anymore. But I want some of that water. And Jesus says in verse 16, to go call your husband and come here. And this is going to lead into him knowing things or telling her that he knows things that he shouldn't have known. What is her response to that in verse 17? Go call your husband and come here. Verse 17, she says what? I have no husband. And Jesus says, you're correct. You have no husband. But what does Jesus go on to say? You've had a few. You've had 5 husbands, and you have one now that's not your husband. Okay. If you're the Samaritan woman, what is going on in your head? This is wild, right? Mind blown at this point. But she has the proper reaction, right? He has to be a prophet. And you could contrast her reaction perhaps to some reactions of other people who saw very clear miracles and still didn't believe. But here, Jesus simply tells her something about her that he shouldn't have known. And she knows that Jesus has to be somebody from God. You have to be a prophet. Okay, so verse 19, sir, I perceive that you are a prophet. What does she say right after that? Verse 19, she perceives that he's a prophet. She continues the conversation. Where does she take the conversation? Talking about worship. And basically a dispute or a disagreement about worship, right? Now, in the lesson material, I believe he mentioned 2 possibilities of this. One is that I discount the second one, or what I'll mention first. He mentioned that maybe she was just trying to change the subject. Maybe so. But I kind of think, I infer she understands he's a prophet, and she wants to know more from somebody who's a man of God, who's obviously from God. And so what she asks is about worship and probably a long standing dispute between the Samaritans and the Jews. The long-standing dispute was the Samaritans worshipped on Mount Gerizim. We worship on this mountain. But Jews say that you have to worship where? In Jerusalem. So settle this dispute. Settle this question. Tell me about worship. How does Jesus answer that? Okay. So verse 22 would kind of be that he very shortly answers her literal question. When he says that salvation of the Jews, or we know what we worship for salvation is of the Jews, that I think Jesus is indicating just in that short little response that the Jews were basically correct about that. However, that's not the main answer to her question. What's the main answer to her question?
In spirit and truth.
Okay, a day is coming and now is, right? So he turns it and says, really, it's not going to be about Jerusalem, and it's not going to be about Mount Gerizim. It's not going to be in either one of those. But notice he says in verse 23, but the hour is coming and now is when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth, for the Father is seeking such to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth. And you could also look back at verse 21 when he basically says the hour is coming when you won't worship on the mountain or in Jerusalem. Okay? So Jesus takes this question that would have been, again, a long-standing question between the Samaritans and the Jews. Where are we supposed to worship? Briefly answers that, but then he turns it to where he needs it to go, and that is what type of worship needs to be done going forward. Okay?
She says the Messiah is coming in Hillsborough.
Okay, yeah, that's right after that, in verse 25, which again I think is kind of neat, at least, that she recognizes and understands that they were looking for the Messiah. She's looking for the Messiah. They're all looking for the Messiah. And the Messiah will settle all these things, is the idea. But Jesus says the most important piece out of that, to me, is verse 24, when Jesus says that those who worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. What does that mean? Heart and mind? Okay. I would agree. How else might you? There's some other ways you could answer that question. What does it mean to worship in spirit and in truth?
Doing things in the correct way and in the correct manner and being in the correct manner.
Okay. So truth would be doing it correctly, correct manner. Spirit would be doing it with the right attitude. Right? Is that essentially the same? Do you have another?
Yeah, that's what I was going to say about attitude and facts. It's fact. It has to be factual based on truth.
Now, we could, you probably heard sermons about this verse. We could talk about it for a long time. Both sides are important about worship. Do it in the correct way. And I think we strive to do worship and to worship God in the way that he prescribes, right? Everything that we're going to do today in worship to God, we can point to Scripture that says that we ought to do it, right? But the other side is just as important. To worship in spirit means that when we come together and we're worshiping God today, our heart better be there. Our heart better be in it. And if our heart is not in it, then what? It's in vain. It's useless. It's no good. We might as well just stay at home. Our heart has to be there. We cannot justify ourselves by saying, I got up this morning, I got ready, and I'm in a pew this morning. Well, okay, that's good. But it's more than that, right? It's more than just occupying a seat and going through the motions of worship. Worshiping in spirit involves our spirit, our heart, our attitude.
That's what the Jews were condemned.
Exactly. Exactly. Any questions or comments there?
Matt, I find it interesting though in verse 23, he mentions true worshipers. What does that infer? Why?
There could be not true worshipers.
It could be false worship.
Right.
And so any worship is not acceptable. It has to be, and the question she asked was about which one is true.
Yep, exactly.
So he answers that here. This is true worship.
Exactly. All right, we're going to have to move on in the text. The questions don't really focus on the rest of the chapter or the rest of this section, but I do want to mention it here. What you have there is obviously in verse 28, the woman leaves. Okay, so the disciples come back, the woman leaves. Where does she go? She goes back to the village, to the city, and what does she do? She basically tells everybody, could this be the Christ? This man told me all that I ever did. Now, that's a little bit of exaggeration, but he knew stuff, right? Could this be the Christ? And verse 30, all the people from the city are coming to Jesus. But verse 31 through 38, you have a little aside, which is not really focused on the lesson at all, but it's Jesus' conversation with his disciples. And it's another illustration. Remember, the disciples had gone to get food, and they're trying to get Jesus to eat, verse 31. And he uses that as an opportunity to teach another lesson. What's the lesson that Jesus teaches about food?
The same thing that he told the devil when he was being tempted.
Okay.
He was not living by bread alone, but by bread.
It's essentially the same lesson that he just taught the Samaritan woman at the well. Instead of living water, now it's about food that you don't know. I have food that you don't know about. Okay? And obviously the disciples' minds are going, what? Somebody else brought him food? Where does he have food? But his point here is that you can gain strength and nourishment from another. It's a spiritual nourishment type of point there. He also then goes on, talks about the harvest and reaping the harvest and sending them out. But that's a little aside. The end of this story is in verse 39 through verse 42. What is the end of the story? Okay, yeah, you see in verse 39 through 42, to their credit, and I would say, I know many of the multitudes of the Israelites or the Jews believe, but these Samaritans, I think, put Jews to shame to a large degree. Because based on what the woman said, and then based on what Jesus said, many people believed. And, what's interesting there in verse 39 through 42 is, I don't know if Jesus did any other miracles other than telling the woman about her past. And they knew who he was. He was the Messiah.
He did state clearly, I am the Messiah.
Well, he did to the Samaritan woman in verse 26. Yeah, basically. Yep, I who speak to you, El Nahi, in verse 26. What do you learn? So just some quick takeaways. We got 2 other verses to cover back in Luke. But what do you learn from Christ's encounter with the Samaritan woman? Where's some quick lessons?
One of the lessons I learned is how to deal with sinners. He did not slam her, he did not condemn her, he didn't slap her around with scriptures.
Okay.
He listened to her and he taught her.
Okay. And he turned a physical conversation into spiritual.
And I think a lot of times we are quick to condemn rather than to teach.
Okay.
There's time for both, obviously.
Agreed?
But I like the way Jesus dealt with one.
Anybody else?
You learn about focus. Paul was to be a preacher to the Gentiles, but here Jesus was the first one that taught Gentiles.
Yeah, mostly Gentile, I guess, if you want to consider their heritage. In the book of Acts, remember, it's the Jews, Samaria, and the rest of the world. So Samaria is kind of in the middle, somewhere.
Well, you learn both his humanity and deity.
Okay?
He was thirsty and hungry physically, but he also proved he was deity because he knew all about this.
All right. Any other lessons?
All people deserve living water.
All people deserve living water.
He picked someone that, she was not a wholesome person, and then on top of that, her genealogy.
Yep. Yeah, I have that written 2 different ways. Don't judge a book by its cover. Kind of likely converts. She was not the likely convert, right? And also the bias and prejudice. I think this, John 4, is a lesson about bias and prejudice. Jesus didn't have that in him. He just simply saw this woman as somebody who was a prospect for the gospel.
Philip must have been there and noticed that, or heard about it, because he got headed up to Samaria to preach the gospel to it.
Well, the Spirit led him to Samaria to preach the gospel as well, but he may very well have known about what happened. So turn quickly to Luke chapter 3, verses 19 and 20. This is simply a couple of statements about John the Baptist, and the writer mentions in the lesson material why he placed this here in the chronology there. But basically here what we read about is that Herod throws John the Baptist into prison. So let's answer these questions really quick. True and false. About Herod Antipas. He was the son of Herod the Great. True. He was Jewish. False. He was eager to learn the message of John, learn from the message of John.
Well, Mark 6 verse 20 says he gladly heard it.
So false with a hint of truth. He liked to listen to him, but I don't know that he was eager to learn. So that's kind of how I answered it. I have that verse as well. He believed that Jesus was the Messiah. We're not giving any indication that he did. I would say false.
John risen from the dead.
Tetrarch of Galilee and Perea. True. Wise and responsible. Absolutely false. And he took his brother's wife. That is true. And then the last question is, why was John imprisoned? Okay, so I do have a little qualification on this one. From just this text, you would basically draw the connection. He rebuked Herod for having his brother's wife. If you look at Matthew 14:3 and Mark 6 verse 17, what was the ultimate reason they put John in prison? Because of Herodias, for the sake of Herodias. So I don't know, was he mad enough himself to throw John in prison because of the rebuke? What I would read from Matthew 14 and Mark 6 was, it really wasn't that. It was more that his wife was really mad about it there. That's how I would read that. And that's why he was thrown into prison. Any final questions, thoughts? We started out with phrases. The phrases that I would pick out of this: he must increase, I must decrease, give me a drink, worship him in spirit and in truth, and perhaps he told me all that I ever did. But those are some of the phrases that I think impact